to another episode of Martinis with Vesper. Today, I want to talk about inspiration, where it comes from, what it means to us, and how it can influence the things we create. I'll be speaking mostly from my own experiences as a designer and artist, but I also want to explore how inspiration can look completely different from one person to another. Inspiration can come from almost anywhere. It can come from what we see, what we hear, the environments we're surrounded by, our culture, our memories, or even historical events. Sometimes it's something incredibly obvious, and other times we don't even realize something has inspired us till much later. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about inspiration. It's personal. What inspires me might mean absolutely nothing to somebody else, and vice versa. So let's start with the actual definition of inspiration. The Oxford Dictionary defines inspiration as the process of being mentally stimulated to do or feel something, especially something creative. And I actually really like the idea of being stimulated because that's exactly what inspiration feels like to me. There's this excitement that happens. You suddenly want to make something. You want to explore an idea. You want to see where it can take you. And sometimes you know exactly where you're going. And other times you really don't. You might start with one idea, and then somewhere in the creative process, that idea starts changing. Maybe you add something, take something away, change a color, change a fabric, or completely rethink the direction. That happens to me all the time. I'll start designing with a specific idea in my head, and by the time I'm finished, I'm looking at something completely different. And honestly, I think that's part of the fun of creating. Sometimes the inspiration is just the starting point. The design itself takes you somewhere else. Now, as designer and artist, there's one question we get asked consistently. Where do you get your inspiration from? Or simply, what inspires you? And sometimes the answer is easy. Maybe it's a hobby, maybe it's a place you visited, maybe it's your culture, a movie, a book, a piece of music, or something you saw walking down the street. But sometimes there's so many layers to an inspiration that it becomes really difficult to explain. You know when somebody has asked you a question and you have the answer in your head, but the second you try to actually explain it out loud, it comes out in a mumble jumble. That happens to me. And honestly, sometimes when I'm asked where my inspiration comes from, I become a little guarded or even anxious. Not because I don't want to share it, but because there's this little voice in my head wondering, are they going to think it's weird? Are they going to think it's stupid? Are they going to understand why this means something to me? And I think that's something we should keep in mind when we ask artists or designers about their inspiration. If someone seems hesitant to answer, it may not have anything to do with you. Their inspiration might just be deeply personal, and they might be worried about being judged. Sometimes we're really just defending something that feels vulnerable to us. For me, inspiration can come from almost anywhere. And I have a few really distinct memories where I can look back and say, that moment became the beginning of something. One of those moments happened when I was doing my master's degree. We were doing a workshop at the University of British Columbia, and I remember walking through the forest and noticing the trees. some of them had these incredible burn marks from past lightning storms. And that surrounded them was all this beautiful green moss. The colors were incredible. You had the black and charcoal tones of the charred wood, these deep and varied greens in the moss, and all of these rich browns coming through the bark. I remember taking pictures as I walked. Some were really close up, and others were wider shots because I wanted to capture the whole environment. And of course, a photograph can never completely capture what you're actually seeing in person. The depth of color, the texture, the feeling of being surrounded by it. But the photographs gave me enough of a reference to start matching those colors to fabric swatches. And that's where the inspiration started to become a collection. It wasn't about the colors either. The forest also became part of the story behind the collection. I think that's something I really love about inspiration. It doesn't always stop at one element. You might be inspired by a color, but then the color leads you to a fabric. The fabric leads you to a silhouette. The silhouette leads you to a story. And suddenly, you have an entire collection. Another inspiration came from a completely different place. I had been reading some of these spicy novels that had circus themes to them, which is probably not where you would expect a fashion collection to begin. But that became the starting point for a circus-inspired collection I created. I wanted to take the circus and make it feel more elevated, more sophisticated, almost like a higher fashion interpretation of the circus rather than the traditional bright and theatrical version we usually imagine. I used satin and velvet along with argyle patterns to connect these pieces back to the circus theme. I also incorporated glitter and used a color palette of copper browns, black, and silver. The color palette was intentionally more restrained. I didn't want that strong, almost harsh contrast that you traditionally associate with circus performers. And then I was able to bring my Indigenous heritage into the collection as well. I did that through some very simple accessories, but they actually had a huge impact on the overall look of the garments. And that brings me to another really important source of inspiration: culture. Culture can influence so many aspects of design. It can influence your colors, your fabrics, your patterns, your accessories, and even the stories you choose to tell. And I don't think cultural influences always have to be obvious. It doesn't necessarily have to be bold or immediately recognizable. Sometimes it's a print, sometimes it's color, sometimes it's a small accessory that might not even be noticed at first. For me, I would say I fall more into the subtle incorporation of my culture. It might be an accessory or a print of a secondary fabric, and then that element becomes part of the larger story of the collection. I really love doing this because it feels natural to me, and I think that's the key. Culture doesn't have to be something that is added into the design. It can simply be woven into the story. Now, if we look at fashion historically, inspiration has always been a huge part of a runway collection. A runway collection often brings a story. Sometimes it's a story the designer wants to tell. Sometimes it's fantasy. Sometimes it's a political statement. Sometimes it's a memory from childhood that's being reinterpreted through an adult perspective. And I love that because you can take something familiar and completely change it the way we see it. Take Alice in Wonderland, for example. If a designer says, my collection is inspired by Alice in Wonderland, what does that actually mean? Are we going to take the literal elements of the story, the characters, the colors, the imagery, and put them directly into the garments? Or are they going to take the feeling of Alice in Wonderland and reinterpret it? It may become something darker. It may become more surreal. It may become a commentary on adulthood, identity, and society. That's where I think fashion really gets exciting. It's not necessarily taking a story and copying what already exists. It's about taking that inspiration and asking, what else could this mean? And I think that's something we started to lose a little bit in the fashion industry today. We have so much mass production. We have trends moving incredibly quickly and have social media consistently showing us what everyone else is doing. And sometimes it feels like we're seeing the same ideas over and over again. It's not that collections aren't interesting. There's still incredibly talented designers creating beautiful work. But sometimes I miss the story. I miss the feeling that a designer has taken an idea, really explored it, and created something that we haven't seen before. And that makes me wonder, are we losing some of our inspiration? Or are we losing the ability to think creatively? And now with AI becoming such a huge part of the creative world, I think that question becomes even more interesting. If we can ask AI to come up with ideas for us, are we going to start relying on it to do the creative thinking? And if we do, what happens to those strange, personal, unexpected ideas that come from our own experiences? Because maybe inspiration isn't always supposed to make sense. Maybe it's supposed to come from those random things we notice, the places we've been, and the stories we've heard, the cultures we come from, the memories we carry, and even the things that seem completely unrelated at first. Maybe the best ideas are the ones that start with something small and unexpected, and then take us somewhere we have never planned to go. And I think that's what makes inspiration so fascinating. You never really know where it's going to come from. And sometimes you don't even realize you've been inspired until you look back and see where the ideas began. Thank you so much to everyone who took the time to join me for another episode of Martinis with Vesper. It has been my pleasure to share some of my experiences, opinions, and perspectives on the fashion industry with you. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, drink those martinis, put on those heels, and keep looking fabulous.